Hello, this is a short presentation about the evaluation of effective child protection in Gwyneth's Children and Supporting Families Service. My name is Bruce Thornton. I'm an independent consultant and trainer in the area of children's services. I was joint author of the risk model and have consulted and trained on its use across the UK. The risk model has now been incorporated into a wider effective child protection model, and as an expert in the field, I was well placed to assist in the evaluation. This project has been evaluated at both the midpoint and at the end of the project in March 2022. I will talk briefly about all of those evaluations and what we found. The final evaluation study was done by interviewing over 20 members of staff across the organisation and its external partners. In summary, the overall message is that effective child protection has an important contribution to make to child protection practice in Wales and beyond. As someone who has experience in helping local authorities in Wales and England for over 30 years, my recurring thought is, why hasn't someone thought of this before? This is a simple, easy to understand approach that gets to the critically important parts of child protection that needs to be done well. It cuts through the complex process of child protection and places focus on the few critical things that really matter. I have been impressed with the vision behind the model itself and the sheer tenacity and perseverance to continue to work tirelessly on it despite COVID and its challenges. The effective child protection model brings together 4 elements that makes child protection effective. These are conversations that work and don't create resistance to change, good decision making about thresholds, identifying the change necessary to reduce significant harm, and maintaining progress and measuring its success. These can be easily remembered because of the approaches or tools associated with them. So, becoming better skilled in using motivational interviewing or collaborative communication to build relationships with families and to avoid resistance, using the risk model to make good and consistent decisions about likelihood of significant harm, defining the change statements for the 3 key changes necessary to reduce significant harm, and finally, using steps to change to monitor progress in achieving these changes. It is worth noting that in addition to these 4 components, Gwynedd have used practice mentoring to integrate training into practice and have also been developing reflective practice skills in the workforce. I think this emphasises their determination for this to be practical, to be embedded into practice and to make a real difference. If I touch on the interim evaluation that was done in early 2020, this of course coincided with the first COVID lockdown. There were 3 parts to the interim evaluation. 1 looked at mentoring, the other at the impact on social workers. I looked at a sample of case conference reports and minutes from before and after the project. An expert in coaching and mentoring was asked to give a view about how the new role of practice mentor was being developed. This was merging social work practice with some of the coaching and mentoring approaches, both with individuals and in groups. The report was very positive. It identified how coaching was used to develop skills and mentoring and the way it developed long-term capacity of people. It was judged to be innovative in its application of these ideas into social work practice and acknowledged how the practice mentor had been supported and developed in her role. It went beyond that, as it also acknowledged this work was forging a new discipline that blends coaching, mentoring and social work practice into something specific to the sector. I'm pleased to see that 12 months on, Gwynedd is refining this new discipline of practice mentoring in children's services. The second evaluation looked specifically at how well effective child protection was integrating into practice and the way social workers were now thinking about their role. This evaluation coincided with the first COVID lockdown. As such, it reflected the uncertainty of how the model would be adopted to virtual case conferences. It did not make any recommendations that the approaches need to be modified. It found that practitioners felt very supported by the project and had an understanding of the approach. It identified that more attention was needed to the change and measure elements. Again, I am pleased to see that Gwynedd are developing some practice resources in these specific areas. I looked at a before and after evaluation of how case conferences were held. I reviewed social work reports to conference and the conference minute for a sample of cases. This gave me a window on practice that covered both conferences before the introduction of ECP and those that had taken place more recently. Well, the findings really surprised me. Using the model took conferences to a new level of clarity and focus. As I've described before, my observation was, why hasn't somebody thought of this before? It was night and day. My overall opinion was that this work needed to be supported and developed, despite the compromises that came with COVID. This final evaluation comes at the end of the ECP project, and I've taken a different approach. I've spoken to practitioners to find out their experiences of using these ideas in practice. These were individual discussions which were structured but also followed any themes that emerged. Most of these were with practitioners within children's services. They included new and experienced workers, team managers, conference chairs, service managers and the head of service. The key theme was of clarity. Clarity for families about what needed to change and more clarity in conferences and core groups. It is clear that social workers are focusing on change and preparing the change statement in the initial case conferences reports. This sets things up from the start. Because this is integrated into the conference process, it is happening most, if not all of the time, and these workers are making those statements about why care is not good enough, scoring this as a 2, and forecasting how things would be if care was good enough in the future. This sets up the measure element and the use of steps to change. I think we've learned before that practice change takes time and persistence. So, the project sets a standard for how this should be done, and of course, practice is messy and imperfect. But what is interesting is even a small shift towards the aspired standard through better focus on change and more thinking about progressive steps seems to make a big difference to the clarity and effectiveness of practice. I've heard practitioners explain how this new thinking gets them talking to families more than ever about change. It is this change talk that we hear about in motivational interviewing. And I think that we're seeing so many parallels between trying to improve or change practice through ECP at an organisational level with the difficulties of change or improving care in child protection at family level. The words messy, compromise, focus, keeping it simple and keeping going comes to mind, and I think this is true in the project as well. Of these, the 2 that have stood out in the evaluation has been focus and perseverance. This clear focus on simple things, mentoring sessions for everyone, formal training, then refreshers reinforced by practice mentoring, ongoing encouragement, changing important processes to support the model and making it as easy as possible. And for perseverance, that keeping going despite COVID, despite the fact that the service is so pressured that it's difficult to accommodate more of anything. I think these are important messages for any project. Keep focused and keep going. Do so despite your own doubts or the doubts of others. It is the long haul that is important, the long-term changes that we want to achieve, and we can endure short-term setbacks. And indeed, we should expect and plan for difficulties along the way. The overall message from the evaluation is that the basic ideas are sound and need to be encouraged and nurtured. My own message, having worked in children's social care for 50 years, is to carry on confidently. Don't let the critics and doubters distract you, those who often have an opinion but don't seem to be able to offer any practical solutions to all the problems they can identify. My experience in assisting local authorities to implement changes is that it requires that there is a clear practice model that makes improvements. In this case, massive improvements, that the changes required are straightforward and are understood by those who will implement them, that they are supported, listened to, and adaptations are made, that there is persistence to keep going, and that there is an acceptance that it will take time. There is clear evidence that these are in place and working well. I conclude with some comments from the interviews I conducted. There were a number of concerns and barriers to implementing ECP, as you'd expect. I heard about difficult practice had been during COVID, and that virtual work and the use of PPA made building trust, forming relationships, and just having time with families more difficult. These are the foundations of collaborative work, so I can well understand how additionally difficult this has been recently. There were also comments about the sheer pressure of work and the recent increase in staff change in teams. I understand this, as it may seem that workers are being asked to do more, or certainly to do things differently. In contrast, people have also said that conference is shorter, the practice is more efficient, and that things are more focused. More specifically about ECP itself, I heard about the value of using steps to change in core groups, but that it took more time. There was a call for other agencies to receive more training on ECP, as they didn't understand what practitioners were trying to do. I heard again about the need for more common understanding by other agencies about the thresholds. I've heard this over the years, and I know that work has taken place on it, but the question of threshold and who should do what and well will always surface as a frustration between agencies. Generally, all these comments about difficulties were made in the context of welcoming effective child protection and wanting it to continue. Some of the observations about the value of effective child protection help us appreciate what has already been achieved and what is the positive effect on practice. For example, I think the response of families are more positive and it helps to build better relationships. A strengths-based approach is right and can work well. Mentoring was invaluable. It's helped me to see the family's view and to respect it. Conferences are shorter and more focused. It was helpful to explain why a young person is at senior risk and what is needed to reduce risk. This framework increases staff confidence in their practice. This was one comment that I heard several times. Young people are more involved in their plans. For example, I had missing from home episodes with a young person, and we were able to better understand what was happening and the progress being made. Steps to change are very well done in conferences, despite being online. Clarity about what needs to change is understood by the families. There is much more focus in practice. I heard this comment several times as well. It's more efficient. Use of self, understanding self, and self-awareness has been developing, has the ability to reflect on practice. I find it easier to accept the family for themselves, and I think this gives them confidence to open up. It helped me to agree extremely clear goals that are achievable for the family. There is more evidence of young people's involvement in the process. The clarity about outcomes has improved such a lot. I heard this comment several times. Consideration should be given to introducing ECP into the PLO processes. The influence of ECP can definitely be seen in the way my team manager is supervising us. Interestingly, I also had a comment about complaints processes and how, despite the complaint, the value of ECP was evident. For example, during involvement with two families in the complaint process, comments were made by them that, Despite the issues of disagreement, both families were positive about what they called the ladder thing, meaning the steps to change. They said that it really helped. There were small things that the social worker, the health visitor and the family were going to do. Breaking it up into these steps made it clear. As I bring this to a close, you will have noticed a few clear messages in the comments and my overall findings. That, despite the pressures of this work, this has been universally welcomed. We have 4 components of the model: more collaborative conversations, consistent risk assessment, a focus on change to reduce the risk of significant harm, and measuring progress in reducing risk. Added to these, we have 2 enablers: the use of a practice mentor and developing reflective practice. So, have we seen progress on these elements? We hear a resounding yes and an appetite to keep going and embedding what has already been achieved. 2 of the most profound contributions this model has made have been, firstly, that focus on change, reflected in the change statements identified in the case conference, and secondly, in measuring progress, using steps to change. It seems to me that the evaluation has clearly heard of the value of these 2 things to practitioners. 2 simple and very practical additions that seem to have made things much more effective. I have asked, why hasn't someone thought of this already? And I can say confidently, thank goodness someone has and had the determination to push it forward. I acknowledge the vision behind this and hope this work can influence practice beyond Gwynedd in the future. Thank you.